Our New Testament reading is from the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 43 through 54. This is the story about Jesus gathering his disciples. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph from Nazareth." Nathanael said to him, "How can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." When Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said of him, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Amen. Thank you, Al. A few weeks ago, I was cooking supper when I accidentally knocked over the salt shaker. Without even thinking, I picked up the shaker and tossed a little bit of salt over my left shoulder. As I was preparing my message this past week, I asked the question, now why did I do that? Like I said, without even thinking about it. Why did I do that? So I did a little research. I found an article about the history of salt on, as you might expect, the Morton Salt website, which said this, and I quote, "The widespread superstition that spilling salt brings bad luck is believed to have originated with the overturned salt in front of Judas Iscariot at the Last Supper, an incident immortalized in Leonardo da Vinci's famous painting." Now, I've got to be honest with you. I have looked through the New Testament from beginning to end for 40 years, and I have yet to find one verse, one, that says Judas spilled salt at the Last Supper. However, I have no doubt that somewhere on some shelf there is a PhD dissertation on that very topic. Positive of that. Do you have little good luck traditions that you grew up with that, whether consciously or unconsciously, you still practice? Do you do those little things? Competitive sports is filled with these behaviors. I've been reading a book by Dr. Stephen Olvey titled Rapid Response. Olvey practically invented the practice of emergency care in the sport of auto racing, particularly in its most dangerous form, open wheel racing, which is the Formula One cars or the Indy cars, the most really hazardous, dangerous forms of racing. Here is how Olvey briefly describes the pre-race rituals of the drivers. The race was now less than an hour away. The 25 drivers were going through their pre-race rituals, each with a different set of habits and superstitions over years of competition. Some still feared the color green and did everything to avoid it. Some would dress in a certain order. Left glove always on before the right one. And he goes on to catalog a number of these little rituals that the drivers do before they get on the track to risk their lives. From tossing salt over the left shoulder to putting on gloves a certain way before a race, these are examples of what psychologists call magical thinking. According to healthcare professionals, magical thinking refers to the idea that we can influence the outcome of certain events by doing something that has no bearing on the circumstances. The field of mental health says there is nothing wrong with following little rituals or superstitions. Generally, everybody does a few. But sometimes magical thinking can be a sign of mental illness if people become obsessed with it. During the time of Christ, magical thinking and magic itself was an accepted part of the culture. Every religion had to deal with magical thinking in one form or another. And the religion of first century Israel was no exception. One of the most vivid examples of the messianic problems created by magical thinking appear in the Gospel of John in a seemingly innocuous encounter between Jesus and a righteous Jewish believer named Nathanael. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him, about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph, from Nazareth." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." When Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him, he said of him, "Here is truly an Israelite, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael asked him, "Where did you come to know me?" Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than these." We know little about the apostle named Philip, and even less about the figure of Nathanael, whose relationship to Christ is really one of more speculation than history. However, the importance of this story is not in the identity of Nathanael, but how he becomes a disciple. Because the way he becomes a disciple represents a paradigm shift between the myths of messianic expectation in first century Israel, or the traditional religion of Israel, and the reality of the Messiah in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. So let's take a moment and dig deeper and explore the story. The story takes place just after Jesus is baptized. In the Apostle John's Gospel, Jesus decides after the baptism to make an immediate journey to Galilee. Jesus is homeward bound. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus' journey will end in Cana, where he will perform his first miracle at a wedding at Cana. But Jesus will not be alone when he arrives in Cana. As we see in chapter 1, Jesus begins to gather a group of followers. First, Jesus invites two of John the Baptist's disciples to come with him to Galilee. Andrew and an unnamed disciple who is probably John, who wrote the gospel. Andrew then connects Jesus with his brother Simon, who is then called by Jesus to follow him, and in doing so is given a new name, Cephas, which means Peter. The story then moves to the next day, a day in which Jesus finds Philip. John mentions that Philip was from the same Galilean city as Andrew and Peter. So Jesus undoubtedly sought him out at their urging. Philip, not Jesus, Philip then goes probably the next day and finds Nathanael, who views the coming of the Messiah in the legendary way that Israel expects the Messiah. We know this because Philip describes Jesus to Nathanael with these words: "We have found him, about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote." Traditional Jewish theology declared that the Messiah would come as the inheritor of David's throne, and would thus take on the title and the authority of King of Israel, displacing Herod and ruling over Israel and then over all the earth. Nathanael answers when Philip tells him about Jesus. Nathanael answers with the traditional Jewish belief that since the Messiah will be the king of Israel, and Jerusalem in the south, in Judea, is David's city, it is impossible for Jesus to be Messiah because he is a Galilean. Nathanael replies to Philip, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" By good here, that was an expression, the word as it is used is, can anything from God? Because you only called God good. Can anything directly from God come out of Nazareth? Nathanael leaps to a conclusion based upon what he has been taught and told about the Messiah, probably from his childhood. Philip's confidence in Jesus' identity is based not upon stories or legends, but upon reality and relationship, which is why Philip challenges Nathanael's answer by saying, "Come and see." Nathanael can't go into the books of doctrine or theology to find out if Jesus is the Messiah or not. It's not going to be a historical identification. Nathanael must have been impressed by Philip's enthusiasm because he accepts the challenge and sets off with Philip to meet Jesus on the road. Now remember, Nathanael is going to meet Jesus not to believe, but to evaluate and inspect. Nathanael has dogmatic expectations about the Messiah, and he approaches Jesus as a judge of Jesus' identity rather than as a disciple. This approach demonstrates Israel's greatest problem in accepting Jesus as the Messiah. He just did not meet their preconceived expectations. Many of those expectations, by the way, which were driven by magical thinking. As Nathanael approaches Jesus with the intent of judging him, Jesus takes the initiative of judging Nathanael by saying, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." While Nathanael's answer to Jesus' words might sound a little self-serving, perhaps even humorous, "Where did you come to know me?" They really are not. Jesus recognizes the sincerity of Nathanael's expectations for the Messiah. And he honors Nathanael's willingness to come to Jesus. We have to remember that those who plotted against and murdered Jesus, the members of the council, the high priest, never had any intention of seeking the truth about Jesus' identity. They simply acted out of their own self-interest. But Nathanael was seeking the truth. Clearly, Nathanael's emotions are triggered when Jesus says, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael has a moment of pure magical thinking, taking Jesus' words completely out of context. Jesus never told Nathanael how he saw him under the fig tree. But Nathanael assumes that it was through some visionary or supernatural process, and applies then to Jesus his own preconceived understanding of the Messiah in his response. "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." For Nathanael, the title Son of God is not the way that we think of Jesus as the Son of God. For Nathanael, the title Son of God leads to a mistaken conclusion that will be imputed to Jesus throughout his ministry, that the Messiah was the true King of Israel, the inheritor of David's physical throne, a king for the earth. At the end of John's Gospel, that is the charge, you might recall, that brings Jesus before Pilate. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." The one who was proclaimed and judged as the King of Israel was in truth not the King of Israel, but in truth the Son of God, a title which had a completely different meaning from what Pilate had been told by Jesus' enemies. So back to our story. Jesus sets Nathanael's feet on a path toward a spiritual understanding of the Messiah when he invites Nathanael to share not a religious dogma, but to share a relationship, a living, breathing, working, walking, talking caring, loving relationship. Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree, you will see greater things than these? Jesus' identity as the Messiah would not be revealed through magical thinking or non-related events from centuries before, but through the disciples' daily experience, their experience of Jesus' teaching, healing, suffering, death, and resurrection. The disciples' confession of Christ as the Messiah would be one of faith and not of judgment. The disciples would not decide who Jesus was for themselves. Jesus would decide who they needed to be for him. The Son of God, not the King of Israel, would take possession of their lives for the sake of God's spiritual kingdom. And no kingdom on earth. You know, today, there's a great deal of magical thinking in parts of Christianity. And it's easy to see. As an example, we see, and this is really kind of a big thing in some kind of more radical Christian circles, we see the political views of those who believe that if they can literally foment a war between Israel and Iran, this will lead directly to the second coming of Christ. We also see magical thinking in the beliefs of those who bring their own expectations and judgments to their Christianity. Some expect by believing in Jesus they'll never have a life with suffering. They'll never experience any suffering. They'll never experience any struggle. They'll never experience any deprivation. Others expect Jesus to punish their enemies, to send to hell anyone that they don't like. Today, right now, this day, as we go into this really important week, there are religious Christians proclaiming that God will see to it through acts of violence that Trump will receive another term as president. These ideas have nothing to do whatsoever with faith in Jesus Christ as God's Messiah. They also have nothing to do with the truth. We get to that real faith when we walk with Christ in real time, just as Nathanael and the disciples did 2,000 years ago. As the Church of Jesus Christ, we have but one task: to serve. Not to serve historical dramas or political agendas or religious doctrines, but to serve the real lives of those around us, those who need compassion, those who need acts of caring. Jesus did not call us to do magic, but to do love. Jesus called us not to change the world, but to change hearts and minds, beginning with our own. Jesus called us not to judge, but to be judged by the Spirit. And in that judgment, to repent and live each day, each moment, as Christ leads us to live it. We all have harmless bouts of magical thinking, and I'll probably always just, without thinking, throw a little salt over my shoulder when the salt spills. But let me ask you a question. Would you refuse to pick up and nurse a wounded or hungry cat because it is black? Would we fail to go to the aid of someone in need if it meant running under a ladder? Would we refuse to visit a lonely shut-in if they lived on the 13th floor or in room 13? I hope we don't even have to answer that ridiculous question. Christianity is not magic. It is hard work. Very hard work, performed by those who are committed to the real Christ and not our idea of who Christ is. It is our work for this day and for every day of life given to us by God.